We are live. No, there's an echo. All right. Where's everybody? All right. You've got. Wait. Hello. We're letting everybody in. Good morning, everybody. Still have some sound. Oh, I know what it is. It's Facebook. Goodbye, Facebook. People are still, John just put out that people are still adjusting to the sound. To the time. Yeah, sorry. I'm trying to figure out the sound. Why is there sound coming through? So I don't know if everyone's adjusting. Hold it 1 second.
That's my face. Hurts. I know.
You set him up for that. All right. Hopefully that was just the sound thing I needed to do.
Don't ask me. How long was you counting?
Just the day. Still, the sound is still coming through. What? Yeah. Yeah, he didn't get any other gigs, so he went back home. He had been out all week. He had been in Orlando for some gigs, and he went to Disney World. But yes, Joe had a great time. He thanked me for arranging it, and definitely wants to come back. We had a great turnout. Yeah, it was nice to see. Somebody told me they got COVID. Yeah. I don't want to say who. They're not on right now, but
Friday night?
yeah. Well, they think. I said I haven't heard anyone else that got sick.
I got the flu.
Probably, but they were worried that they got it from us. So I guarantee them that
Anywhere near me?
on your side, but not not right near you. Why am I still getting sound? There we go. That's better now. You were sitting in the back, and they were a few rows away from you. But who knows if they were sick that night? I mean, come on. I'm not gonna take responsibility for it. Was a full house, but
Next time there's a full house.
you said that before. You didn't get sick. I only told you that somebody got sick just because I want to tell you that that's the world we live in today, where somebody's going to say, you don't know. But we just don't want, we don't want to be responsible or irresponsible, but I don't think we are. What else to tell people? So yeah, that was a good weekend. We also had a successful Mahjong weekend for people who played Mahjong. They had a good time. And
So why is Mahjong a Jewish thing?
Why is Mahjong a Jewish game? That's a good question. There actually was a movie about it, documentary.
It's a game, right?
Yes. So there's a whole study that somebody did about how it became a Jewish game, because it's a Chinese game. It's not even big outside of China. And in China, it's usually not played by women. It sometimes is, but it's not like it's not like here, it's almost entirely women. And in New York, it got big, and then it spread to, as Jews moved to Florida and other places, it became this game that was primarily played by groups of Jewish women. It never really took off anywhere else. I mean, for whatever reasons, it was never popular outside of the Jewish community. But you could say there was a certain, I think people liked it because it was, well, I mean, the movie kind of talks about why it became big, but I think there's a social aspect of it that is also not uncommon, I guess, in Chinese groups, where, people play regularly with each other. It's like bridge or some of these other games that, you have four people and it's a nice, like it's an easy, manageable kind of group that you can maintain. So I think the social aspect of it is probably really the most important. But yeah, there's a movie. I'm trying to look for the title of said movie, but it's Judith, did you ever see the movie?
You have to be over 70 to play.
I have not seen the movie.
Did you see the movie, Judith?
No, I did not see the movie.
Yeah, John is the only non-female.
But we don't know that he's not.
No, Jeff Stein knows how to play and
Jeff
has
Stein.
played.
Oh, I can find myself.
Yes, I said it, non-binary, whatever. So it's called Mahjong, the Tiles That Bind. And you can see it online. Here, I'll show you. It wasn't very hard to find.
I will tell you also that the
1998.
more not educated,
What?
the more intellectual Jewish groups that I grew up around scorn Mahjong and say that you should be playing bridge. That Mahjong is the lesser of the two games.
Yeah,
My family, I have to say, my family played bridge.
My family played bridge, and my father used to laugh at me when I said I was going to play Mahjong. He's like, "Really, Mahjong?" I'm like, "Yes, father."
I think there was that. I think there was that a little bit of, it was harder to play bridge and this kind of, you had to study it a little bit. It was a little bit more like chess, but
Yeah, there's a little more, and you have to work with another person in a different way.
yeah. Yeah, I don't, I know that that used to be the case, but I
No,
think
not
that
anymore.
Mahjong kind of fell out of, first of all, I don't think Mahjong was ever as big on the West Coast as it was on the East Coast. I mean, I don't think.
I don't think so either. Because
It's
on the
gotten-
West, I think the West Coast was more Asian anyway than the East Coast.
Yeah, but I don't know why Mahjong wasn't. What I'm saying is I think Mahjong was bigger on the East Coast. I think it was, I mean, that's definitely where it became popular. I think that it was more of a, like, you needed to have like a cultural, there had to be like cultural ties that made people, had people do this kind of stuff, which I think was closer on people were closer on the East Coast, but I don't know. But you asked an interesting question. And if you want to learn more, see the Tiles That Bind.
Did you just say you don't, John?
No, that was Mike. Who
Oh,
brought
that
up
was
the
Mike.
question-
Okay.
who brought up the question in the first place.
Ah.
But yes, it's the Tiles That Bind. It's not a long, it's a short, so you don't have to spend a lot of time learning the history of it. But I do know that it was weird watching it in China, because watching the Chinese play Mahjong, they were definitely not having as good a time as the Yentas were having here. They were taking it way more seriously, and
Well,
I'm
the
sure there was
financial
more.
investment in Asian
Correct.
Mahjong.
Correct. I think
you
it
know,
was. I think it was some serious, in some cases, some serious money going down. So they weren't laughing and giggling and telling
Yeah.
stories. They were very intensely trying to crush each other and take someone's money. So yeah, it was
I
funny.
taught
It's funny to see the same game being used for completely different reasons.
I taught a Filipino friend of mine how to play American style Mahjong with the card. And she got it. She said, was telling me some of the similarities and the differences. And then she points at the card and she goes, "What are the little numbers?" And I said, "Well, that's what you win. If you win this hand, everybody gives you a quarter." And she looked at me, she goes, "It's a lot of effort for a quarter."
Yeah. Yeah.
She said that her mother had been in $40 and $50 games of traditional Mahjong. Like, yes,
Right.
$4 or $5 is more like it in American, if it's a good day.
Right. I know. All right. But that's why John likes it. So Mike, did I see zone of interest? No, and I don't want to see it now. Now I don't want to see it. No, look, I mean, that's what I was spending a lot of time yesterday dealing with people who were flipping out, which again, I didn't know anything about the guy before. I didn't know anything about Jonathan Glazer before. It was kind of shocking. When you read the actual text of what he said, it's a little less shocking, but at the same time, it was disappointing that, that's I mean, it's really disappointing. So he said, well, what people heard was that he refutes his Jewishness because of what's happening in Gaza. It's not exactly what he said, but he basically said, and he did say the victims of October 7th. It's not like he said Israel's victimizing the Palestinians. I'm not hedging. I'm just saying the whole I don't know, the whole thing was disappointing because he used the opportunity of talking about the Holocaust to then talk about the Palestinians, which a lot of people felt was hijacking the message of the Shoah. And so there was people who were, I mean, not people, the majority of people who heard it were shocked and upset and trying to figure out, like, is there a response? I have people that are trying to write letters to the academy. Like, I don't know what the academy is going to do about it. There's people who've been making political statements, in some cases upsetting and odd and strange messages that they've given out over the Oscars in many years. This one, actually, to some extent, I was surprised there wasn't more. But that being said, because I mean, there's Ukraine going on right now. There's the situation in Israel, Gaza going on right now. There's there's stuff in society, Roe v. Wade. There's so many things that people could have gotten up and started spouting their political message on. And again, sometimes it's relevant if the movie is about something that's about, people are talking about, then of course, but sometimes people have kind of just used it for their own political platform. I mean, there was the famous example of Marlon Brando, winning an Oscar and sending up somebody to speak on behalf of the Native American community. People have done stuff over the years that, again, has really been very political. And this, I think, overall, that was one of the few things that
Yellow.
was political. So,
Well, that short, that from the Ukrainian.
yes, the Ukrainian, yes. Yeah, that I think a lot of people felt was pretty powerful, the Ukrainian speech. Mariupol, whatever, something days in Mariupol, 20 days or whatever it was. I can't remember, sorry. But yeah, that was pretty powerful. He said, I wish I had never gotten this Oscar.
Right.
Which was pretty powerful. Yeah. So anyways, I think overall it was not as bad as I thought, actually. But I will tell you that Shira was coming home yesterday, or not yesterday, Sunday, and she got stuck in those protests that were going on, and they blocked her car. The Palestinian protesters blocked her car, put a cone in front of her car so she couldn't move. And she, was a little anxious about it. She was a little nervous, and she was on the phone with me, and I was like, just take the cone and toss it. So she did. She tossed it, and then they threw it back at her, and then she threw it away from them, and then she drove off. But she said it was a little scary. She said people were surrounding the cars. There was limited amount of police. She said there was some FBI there that was taking statements, but it was overall, she said it was, there wasn't enough police presence, and they really weren't doing anything to stop people from harassing cars as they were driving by. So she got caught in it. It was not, she made it out, but we're proud of her for, not just getting scared, but she got out of it. She's by herself. So 19-year-old girl by herself, surrounded by people screaming at her, and screaming at her, actually, because I mean, they didn't know she was Jewish, but she took it definitely personally. She's been following the news every day, and you know, it's made her, I'd say, stronger in her feelings about her people and her country and everything else, but it's not something that we thought she'd have to be dealing with. And she's probably a little too affected by it because she's reading a lot, and she's really she's following stuff on TikTok and stuff like that that's really negative. So she's always monitoring to see what celebrities are saying stuff, and usually again the negative stuff. So anyways, let's take a look at our text today, which today, first, we're going to read the shortest book in the Bible. That's right, the shortest book in the Hebrew scriptures. There's a slightly shorter book in the New Testament, in the Christian scriptures, but this is 21 verses. It's one chapter, 21 verses, and it is a prophet that I would say people have a hard time remembering because there is so little of this that we quote or deal with. It definitely had a reason for being in the Bible, which is why it was kept, why it was canonized. We know very little about Obadiah. Obadiah means the servant, Eved Adonai. It's servant of God. His entire prophecy is against the Edomites, Edom, which again is in modern day Jordan. It's the southernmost nation on the Jordanian side. It goes Edom, Moab, and Ammon on that side of the river. Edom are descendants of Esau, so they're more closely related to us than any other nation, right? Because they're actually descendants of Isaac. They're not just descendants of Abraham, like the Midianites would be, or cousins of the cousins or nephews of Abraham through Moab, like Moab and Ammon were. The Moabites and Ammonites are descendants of Lot. They're related, but they're not as closely related. At least according to the Bible, the Edomites are literally like our cousins. They are to Jacob, they are Jacob's brother's kids. And so they are very closely related, which means, again, probably they were culturally very similar. We know that a little bit about them from archaeology, which is that they worshiped a pantheon of gods that are similar to the gods of the region. They were primarily lived in the desert. We don't really know what happened to them. The last Edomites, the last Idumeans, as we call them, were King Herod and his family. Around that time, the Idumeans stopped being a separate country and were absorbed by the Nabateans, the people that built Petra, and eventually the Nabateans disappeared into the people that we call Arabs. So there are descendants of Edomites that are floating around Jordan and Saudi Arabia, but we really don't know much about them because for 2,000 years they've not existed as a country. But during the time of King David and during the time of through Obadiah and through the time of the Babylonians, they were a pretty successful country for some of the time. They sometimes were under control of Judah, and sometimes they weren't. They really weren't. They were under control of the United Monarchy of David and Solomon, and then they continued to be under the rule of the Southern Monarchy of the Kingdom of Judah. So they oftentimes found some levels of independence. They sometimes were able to kind of get Judah off their back and not pay taxes to them and not have to be a subjugated nation. But it went back and forth. And what Obadiah is talking about here in the text is a time when the Edomites not only got out from under our heel, but they actually attacked us. And what Obadiah will talk about is the fact that the Edomites will be paid back for what they did. He is very upset about how the Edomites gathered up against us with our enemies and took advantage of the situation. This happens again during times when Judah is attacked by Assyria and by Babylonia. it wasn't one time that the Edomites did it. They would do it when there was a time for them to kind of take advantage of the political situation and attack us. That's not uncommon in the ancient world. I mean, those kinds of alliances and these kinds of things happening were pretty standard. The difference, of course, is that it's in our Bible. It became saved in our Bible, and so it froze this in there. The question of why Obadiah is so incensed by this and why he writes this and why this prophecy comes to him, we don't know. The theory or the tradition is that he is Edomite himself, that he's actually a descendant, is Edomite, and believes that Judah is supposed to be in control. And so he's deeply offended by it because he creates a situation where his own people, his own ethnicity, has attacked the kingdom that he feels they should be a part of. I don't know that that's the case. I'm not so sure that that's really the case. But it is possible, and the reason that it exists as a situation is because it happened. There were cases of Edomites who believed, maybe they became Jewish and they started worshiping Jewish in Jerusalem, and that became their religion. And so for them, any movement away from God would have been a negative thing. If that's the case with Obadiah, then it makes sense. We don't know that, but that's the tradition, is that he himself was Edomite, and which why it upsets him so much. Look, one of the reasons why it is possible is King Herod was Edomite. His father was Edomite, his grandfather. He came from Edomite royalty. And yet he became a Jew, or he was Jewish enough that he built the temple that the Romans destroyed. Understand that King Herod, during the time of Augustus Caesar, he was close with Augustus Caesar, he literally raised the temple and built a new temple on top. There was the second temple, he took it down with permission. It wasn't like he did it without the permission of the priest, but he rebuilt the temple, and he rebuilt most of the holy precincts of Jerusalem to make it beautiful. He was an Edomite. He was not Hebrew or descendant of Jacob. He was a descendant of Esau. And yet he did that. And the priests it seems like most of the people were okay with what he did and recognized it as an important thing. Nobody said that the temple that Herod built was bad. On the contrary, they said it was beautiful. And from what we know of the time, the temple that this Idumean king built, and he ruled out of Israel. Remember, he didn't rule out of Edom. He ruled out of Israel. He ruled out of Jerusalem. He had a palace in Jericho. He built Masada. He built Caesarea as his coastal palace. We know that the temple in Jerusalem he built was the most beautiful temple in the world. And that's why he built it. He built it so that people from around the world would say, the most beautiful temple in the world is the temple to God, and it is in Jerusalem. Now, part of the reason why he did that is because he knew that his people, the Jewish people, his country, was famous for having one God. And so there didn't have to be 50 temples in the city. Like most capitals, Rome, for example, but also Damascus, and every city in the ancient world had many temples for many gods. We had one God, and we put all of our energy into one place. And so he did that, and he wanted the temple to be so amazing that Romans would come, people from around the Roman Empire would come to Jerusalem and say, this is the most beautiful temple in the world. And he seemed to have done that. He seemed to have accomplished that. So could Idumeans do that? Yes. This was written 500 years before King Herod. So this was written long before him. Did he look at these prophecies? Did he look at the texts about Edom in the Bible, in the book of Kings? Did he look about, remember, we just read the prophet Hosea who talked about Edom. Amos talked about Edom. Ezekiel, the prophets talk about Edom. And did King Herod look at those and say, as an Edomite, well, they seem to be talking badly about our people. But let's take a look at this one, because this is only about Edom. This is a prophet who has one thing on his mind. He has one chapter, and this is what we'll read today. And then we're going to get into Jonah, and we'll talk about that. But let's read these 21 verses of Obadiah, which again means the servant Eved Adonai, the servant of God. And that is clearly, by the way, the name of God, right? That is the Yud-He-Vav-He name that's in his name. So if there's a question of whether it's El, which was just, would be God, no, this is the Yud-He-Vav-He name. It's right there. I don't know why they don't translate it as Lord, which they really should, or they translate it as God. But let's take a look. Rosemary, if you'd be so kind as to read for us this Obadiah, this chapter.
The prophecy of Obadiah. We have received tidings from God, and an envoy has been sent out among the nations. Up, let us rise up against her for battle. Thus said the sovereign God concerning Edom. I will make you least among nations. You shall be most despised. Your arrogant heart has seduced you, you who dwell in clefts of the rock, in your lofty abode. You think in your heart, who can pull me down to earth? Should you nest as high as the eagle? Should your eyrie be lodged among the stars? Even from there, I will pull you down, declares God.
Yeah, so there's a couple of themes that are in this book, and there are a couple of the imagery that's consistent with this, which is the Edomites live in the mountains. They and by the way, a lot of the Judeans lived in the mountains too, but these people really lived in the mountains, and they would live in caves. They would live in rocks. For those of us who've been to Petra and seen what the Nabateans did, what the Edomites, their descendants did, these were people that lived in rock, and they would build forts in the rocks. They did amazing stuff. But Obadiah says it doesn't matter where you hide. And he compares them to even eagles, birds, which obviously can nest in some of these crags and things like that. He says it doesn't matter where you're going to hide, guys. You can even put your and by the way, here's one of those places where heights include in the heights of even in this case where the stars are. That's what it says, Kochavim. So it actually says among the stars. So it doesn't actually even say heavens here. It says among the stars. But it seems to be like way up in the sky. So eagles, and even if you go further up, it doesn't matter. I will pull you down from there. So it's a great image, and it's one that kind of builds on the fact that the Edomites are in those places, and then it's made even more beautiful by that imagery that even if you're nestled among the stars, I'm going to pull you down.
If these were to come to you, marauders by night, they would steal no more than they needed. If vintagers came to you, they would surely leave some gleanings. How utterly you are destroyed. How thoroughly rifled is Esau. How ransacked his hordes. All your allies turned you back at the frontier. Your own confederates have duped and overcome you. Those who ate your bread have planted snares under you. He is bereft of understanding. In that day, declares God, I will make the wise vanish from Edom, understanding from Esau's mount. Your warriors shall lose heart, O Teman, and no one on Esau's mount shall survive the slaughter.
Yeah. Again, they are using Esau synonymously with Edom, right? So they're calling out, we're descendants of Jacob. Sometimes we're called Jacob. think we're actually going to be called Jacob. Yeah, for sure, we're called Jacob by the end of this chapter. We're called Jacob. So referring back to our ancestors, the brothers, Jacob and Esau, it makes sense that it's going to happen here. And so, we read about Esau. We stopped reading about Esau in the book of Genesis. We'll get to that. We'll get to that when we finish. But again, it's by referring back to Esau, they're also reminding us of our connection to them, right? Because that's our common ancestor. Esau was as much Isaac's son and Rebekah's son as Jacob was. He's as much Abraham's grandson as Jacob was, as our ancestor. So Teman is also in the desert. It's in that area. It's also used as a synonym for Edom. Today, Teman is the word that we call Yemen, is called Teman. So if you look at Yemenite food in Hebrew, it's Teman. A Yemenite person is Temani. So it's actually used for Yemen today. But in the Bible, it's probably a little bit closer to us, like maybe Jordan or Saudi Arabia. But it was the part of Edom that, again, could be synonymous. And here we have it right here. It's the next verse.
For the outrage to your brother Jacob, disgrace shall engulf you, and you shall perish forever.
And so there it is, the outrage to your brother Jacob, right? So that is a pretty powerful line, that you've hurt your brother, right? For the outrage to your brother Jacob. Again, there's not a lot of details about what they did to us, but again, we know, and there is enough for us to say this, they're going to get payback for this. But I will tell you this, in verse 10, the outrage is not the translation that the King James has for that. What is the translation of? For those violence. And Judith, why don't you read this word for us in verse 10? Hello? Well, you're still there, Judith?
Sorry.
I wanted someone who read Hebrew. Judith,
Sorry.
what's that word?
Mechamas.
Yeah. So my point here is the word Hamas right here means not outrage. It's a bad translation. It means violence. That's what the word Hamas means in Hebrew. Now, that's not exactly how Hamas understands their name in Arabic, but it's similar. It's not outrage or violence, but struggle but for us, every time in Israel they say the word Hamas, there's no question of what it means. And the people of Hamas know what Hamas means in Hebrew. So that is the word right there, Hamas. Hamas means for or from. But the word Hamas, it's not the only time we have it in the Bible, but definitely this week and the last several weeks, it is, when we come across that word in biblical readings, it definitely has added outrage, if you will, because of the violence. For the outrage to your brother Jacob. Yeah, it's a powerful phrase that could be used against the people there too. Which again implies, by the way, for the people who are thinking I'm simply making a negative political statement about Hamas or Gaza or Arabs, understand that contained in that is this understanding that they're our brother, right? And so what that does is, on one hand, it calls out the violence, it calls out how tragic this is, but at the same time, it reinforces the connection, which I think is an important thing to do. And I think it is the hope is that will be established and acknowledged, right? And so it works because, to some extent, the power of the relationship, that the way it should be. So let's take a look.
On that day when you stood aloof, when aliens carried off his goods, when foreigners entered his gates and cast lots for Jerusalem, you were as one of them. How could you gaze with glee on your brother that day, on his day of calamity? How could you gloat over the people of Judah on that day of ruin? How could you loudly jeer on a day of anguish? How could you enter the gate of my people on its day of disaster? Gaze in glee with the others on its misfortune, on its day of disaster, and lay hands on its wealth on its day of disaster. How could you stand at the passes to cut down its fugitives? How could you betray those who fled on that day of anguish? As you did, so shall it be done to you. Your conduct shall be requited, yea, against all nations. The day of God is at hand.
Yeah. I'm not wild about that translation of the way it lays out because it's much more powerful the way it's actually said in Hebrew, which will be closer, I'm sure, to what the King James translates it. Mary, how does it say in verse 15? Yeah. They flipped it for some reason in the translation because it definitely begins the day of God is at hand. I would not say heathen for goyim. I would translate all the nations, but yeah, they flipped the verses. The day of God is at hand, yea, against all the nations. As you did, so shall it be done to you. Your conduct shall be requited. I would probably translate it beyond your head, but because that's the full translation. But yeah, it's a reminder that it's going to come back to you. Karma, right? It's coming back. What you did to us will be done to you.
That same cup that you drank on my holy mount shall all nations drink evermore. Drink till their speech grows thick, and they become as though they had never been. But on Zion's mount a remnant shall survive, and it shall be holy. The house of Jacob shall dispossess those who dispossessed them. The house of Jacob shall be fire, and the house of Joseph flame, and the house of Esau shall be straw. They shall burn it and devour it, and no survivor shall be left of the house of Esau. For God has spoken.
Yep. And so both the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom, the house of Jacob, to some extent, is like the house of Judah, but also the house of Joseph. However you want to look at it, the north, the south, all of Israel will have revenge.
Charlie,
Yeah.
in 16, what's it, because it's older than mine. What's the bar is my own mouth or something?
Well, it's called Har. It says my holy mount. It's Har Kodesh, which is my holy mount, my Har Kodesh, my mountain of holiness. Let's see. What is so the they're definitely, I mean, the point about this is that Jerusalem, even though it was destroyed, people will come back, and I mean, there'll be some that survive. People will come back, and the destruction that was visited on us will be visited on the other people. Again, we're the fire. We're going to be the ones that are punishing the people. And in this case, again, Esau, the people, the Edomites are going to be the ones who are going to get burned. So we're the destruction, we're the destroyers. They're going to be destroyed.
Is the Holy Mount
Jerusalem. We're talking about Jerusalem. So what happened when Jerusalem got destroyed was that essentially all the treasures of the temple and the temple was despoiled. They took stuff away, and the people enjoyed and they took that away. But I mean, part of again, this was during the Babylonian destruction, not the Roman destruction, but during the I mean, it happened during the Roman destruction too, but we're talking here about the Babylonian destruction. What happened then was that, and again, it probably wasn't so much in the Roman destruction. When the Romans destroyed the temple, it was a beautiful building, but it didn't function the same way. The temple that the Babylonians built had treasures in it. It had things that had been dedicated to God, cups and plates and all these kinds of rich treasures. That stuff was taken. Are they talking about a literal cup? Yeah. I mean, could be the literal cups. But for the people, for Obadiah and for the people during his time, that was symbolic of the fact that the place had been ransacked, destroyed, robbed, and essentially there was going to be payback for that. But the later temple, the second temple, didn't have the same kinds of treasures in it. It was the destruction of it itself that was the problem. It wasn't like it was filled with treasures at that point. This one was. So, yeah. And here's what's going to happen to us after we get our vengeance. Check this out.
Thus they shall possess the Negev and Mount Esau as well, the Shephelah and Philistia. They shall possess the Ephraimite country and the district of Samaria and Benjamin along with Gilead. And that exiled force of Israelites shall possess what belongs to the Phoenicians as far as Zarephath, while the Jerusalemite exile community of Sepharad shall possess the towns of the Negev. For liberators shall march up on Mount Zion to wreak judgment on Mount Esau, and dominion shall be God's.
Yeah, so the last few verses are the fact that Israel is going to come back. They're going to re-inhabit all of Israel. But here, if you notice, it says the Phoenicians, it's going to be all the way up into Lebanon, Zarephath, right? It says we're going to be all the way up there. But then there's this weird line that says the exile community of Sepharad, right? So we believe that this is a reference to a place called Saparda, which is in Asia Minor, in Turkey, okay? We know that that's not what we mean when we use the word Sepharad today. And that's because by the Middle Ages, Sepharad was Spain, where Sephardic Jews come from, right? Spain, the Iberian Peninsula, Spain and Portugal. So what's weird about this is that at this point in time, it really probably refers to as far north or as far away from Israel as maybe Turkey. But later on, it goes all the way there. The same reason why in Ashkenaz in the Bible probably also refers to some part of Turkey, or maybe just north of Turkey into Scythia, into the Black Sea area. But later on, Ashkenaz is France and Germany. It goes even further. So Sepharad was Spain. Ashkenaz is next door in France and Germany, in Western Europe. Those areas become much further away than they were in the biblical times, but they become synonymous with those things. What's interesting about this is that it says that these communities will live in the Negev. Well, that's also, by the way, the southern part of Israel. It's the area around Beersheba. It's the area that's been redeveloped. And what's interesting is that in some of those communities, in some of those areas in the Negev, there are huge communities of Sephardic Jews, Mizrahi and Sephardic Jews who actually have settled in that part of the country. It's not intentionally. It's not like, oh, well, let's put all the Sephardic Jews out in the desert and in the Negev. It just so happens that, again, all around the country, there's places where there's more Sephardic Jews, but some of them are actually in the Negev. So this actually did happen. This happened in the last 100 years where Jews from Sepharad have come. It was not necessarily intended that way, in Obadiah's original prophecy, But it must be pretty powerful if you're a Sephardic Jew who lives in the Negev and you've come back to the land of Israel and you live in the Negev and you read this and you say, yeah, this will happen. Again, I don't read that a lot of Israelis want to take over southern Lebanon, but there is a biblical basis for being in southern Lebanon, because it says that we're going to take over the Phoenician territories that go all the way up to the far north. So again, they're really talking about from one end of the country to the other, from the furthest north all the way to the furthest south. We are going to come back. So this small remnant, which is the word that's used here, right? This remnant, right? The word here that they use is pleta. Sometimes they use the word sharit Yisrael, the remnant of Israel. In this case, it's pleta, which is also a word for remnant or survivors, if you will. But here it says, the remnant will survive and they will dispossess the people who dispossess them. So there are definitely reasons why people read this and would think that some of these prophecies have come true, come back in our own day. When do we read this? Well, we don't read this actually very often, or as part of a Haftarah, but it is obviously fairly short. There is actually a Sephardic tradition, because there are different Sephardic and Yemenite traditions on Haftarot. The Sephardic community actually reads this on the Torah portion where we read the story of the descendants of Esau, which is chapter 36 of Genesis. So we have this strange chapter that I've mentioned before. It's chapter 36 in Genesis. So chapter 35, just to refresh your memories, chapter 35 is a chapter that talks about the death of Isaac, right? Goes through at the very bottom, it says, Jacob came to his father Isaac in Mamre, where Abraham and Isaac had sojourned. Isaac was 180 years old. He breathed his last, he died. He was gathered to his kin in ripe old age, and he was buried by his sons, Esau and Jacob. So it tells us that Esau and Jacob buried their father together. Isaac was, they weren't living together anymore, Esau and Jacob, but they came together to bury their father, which is it's a very nice image that they actually buried him, and they buried him where Abraham was buried, at the cave of Machpelah in Hebron. But they weren't together necessarily and live in the same place, but they came together to bury. Then chapter 36 goes into this weird line of Edom. It goes through this list of Esau's descendants, right? And so it talks about him living where Esau lived, and it says these are the names of Esau's sons, and it goes through, and you can see one of them, his name is Taman. So one of the ancestors is the ancestor for that land. So again, when we get into the descriptions of our ancestors and other countries, we oftentimes have place names that are part of the first generations to establish that these are how these cities got their names through these people. So here we have the birth of the Amalekites, one of our worst enemies. It says right here is a descendant of Esau. So that gives us a little bit of that. Then we have these other names of Esau's kids, and we have all these people. These are the lines. These are their clans. This is a whole chapter that has nothing but the descendants of Esau. And then we have in verse 31 this list of kings that rule the Edomites. In chapter 36 goes through this whole list of kings, right? Whole list of kings. And that's what it tells us in chapter 36. There is literally no reason to read that other than the Edomites were so important to us that we had to keep their dynasties alive. Somewhat problematic. Some people say it's maybe the most problematic part of Genesis. And I don't know if Safaria put a note here because it is somewhat problematic. Let's just see if they put it. Yeah. Doesn't
But
say
at the
what.
time, it may have been politically expedient.
Yeah. Here's the problem. They don't quote it here, but here you can see Ibn Ezra talked about it. So here's the interesting thing. We have references to some of these people in the Bible. We've also found some archaeological evidence for these kings in the Bible, that were mentioned here. There's one problem with it, and Ibn Ezra knew it. Ibn Ezra commented on it. The commentary isn't there, but I will tell you the problem with it. Does anybody know what the problem is? Anybody want to guess what I'm about to tell you about that list of kings? Those kings went all the way up to the time of King David.
What's the issue?
It's in the book of Genesis.
Ah. So
They
it's,
didn't live then. They didn't
Yeah.
live during the time of Moses even. So the problem here is that Ibn Ezra basically said that he knew that there was a problem here with the list of Edomite kings chronologically, right? To have it there. So he basically says, look, those who understand this I don't have to say anything. So it was almost an admission that, look, maybe parts of this were not written by Moses. He couldn't flat out say that, but he kind of alludes to that. So the Genesis 36 chapter is a little bit of a problem for people who are literalists who say that Moses wrote the whole Bible. I'm only telling people this because, again, in the context of the Edomites, these things are important because I actually would say, I mean, if I ever wrote a book about the Bible, it would be what the other nations of the Bible tell us about our history. It's a book that no one would read, so that's why I never wrote it. But it would be about people like the Edomites or the Amalekites. Why do these matter? Why did someone include this? It was important to them, and it was important to them because essentially it's foreign policy, it's foreign politics, it's history. And so for people, it was important, and it's all over the Bible. The Midianites, the Phoenicians, I mean, go through all of them. They're there. And so what we said about our neighbors, what we said about our enemies, what we said about our friends, what we said about our related peoples is important because it tells us somewhat chronologically when these things were written. They also tell us probably something about us as humanity, which is that we always kind of like talk about, well, even in our own history, when we're talking about history, if we're teaching history to kids, we talk about World War I, World War II, Korean War, Vietnam War. We're always talking about on a historic level. I mean, again, we'll talk about, someone will talk about the Taft-Hartley, tariffs, or they'll talk about whatever. They'll talk about internal policy, but oftentimes we talk about who our enemies were at that time, what we were fighting for, who we were fighting. And I think the same thing goes for Jewish history. I think the same thing goes definitely for biblical history when we're engaged in these kinds of battles and conflicts. That kind of, it's how you kind of explain yourself to some extent, is against your enemy, against the people that surround you. How are we different from Mexico? How are we different from, we're lucky because we in America, we generally aren't fighting against our neighbors, but there are a lot of countries, I would say most countries have a history of fighting against their neighbors. We really don't. I mean, we fought a couple of battles against Mexico, but we fought a battle with England and Canada 200 years ago, but for most of American history. And again, what defined American history was not our battles with our neighbors. I mean, if you look at France, it's, Franco-Prussian War. It's Napoleon. There's so much about their history that was defined by their enemies. America's a little unusual that way. America, our wars generally are further afield. And so it's not like we're fighting with our neighbors and who our neighbors are and whether our neighbors live in our country and whether we conquered that part of the country and now they're back in our country. But I mean, for people who lived in Alsace-Lorraine or who lived in places, between France and Germany or places, between Russia and Ukraine today, what country you lived in was oftentimes a big deal, right? Because it wasn't guaranteed. So all I can tell you is this is an interesting issue for us because it's in the Bible. And to some extent, it's an important issue because for Israel today, it's going to become an issue because obviously a lot of what Israel deals with is its neighbors and the relationships and the history, the new history that exists between Israel and its neighbors, and what parts of the country are going to be part of the country, et cetera. Those are all things that are still very much up in the air. But the point was, again, that we read that text of Obadiah, or at least Sephardic Jews do, when they read Parshat Vayishlach, which is the story of Jacob and Esau, or at least the end of the story of Jacob and Esau. After their father dies, Jacob and Esau never meet again, at least not in the Bible. We don't hear about them meeting again. And as we saw, sometimes their descendants don't get along. But there are no longer anybody who identify as Edom. There's nobody walking around that say that they're Edomite people. But for us, the Edomites never really disappear because the Edomites became the Romans in our minds. For some crazy reason, Edom became Rome. Maybe, again, that was during the rabbinic period where somehow the Edomites were the Romans. And then later on, the Edomites, when the Romans became Christian, Edom became Christianity. So Edom during the Middle Ages and later becomes synonymous with Christian and to some extent cultural, the dominant culture that we're not trying to assimilate into. So if you talk to people in the Orthodox world today, they would say that Western culture is Edom and we're Jacob, and we're trying not to become like Edom. So Edom was a country, then it becomes Rome, then it becomes Christendom, and then it becomes kind of like Western civilization. So Jews who are religious Jews will see themselves as Jacob, and they'll see the rest of the world as Edom, and they'll see Jews like you and me behaving like Edom, which is not a compliment. So if somebody says you're behaving like Esau, that's not a compliment. It's you should know better, and you're not. And by the way, there's also an understanding that once, like, if you're really Edom, then you're outside the fold. You've already left the fold. If you behave like Esau, then you're only behaving like Esau. You're still Jacob, and I'm laughing because I had an Orthodox rabbi once tell me, as a compliment, that I look like Esau, but I'm not really Esau. Yeah. There's a famous story in the Bible of Jacob dressing as Esau to trick his father, right? To get from his father the blessing, right? And his father says to him, you look like Esau, but I think you're still Jacob, right? So it was meant as a compliment, but it was kind of weird that, again, for somebody who doesn't dress or act like them, that I'm still like them, which was, I guess, a compliment. But yeah. So dressing like Esau to accomplish a goal is an okay thing. It's trickery, by the way, but it's still okay. Interesting, right? Anyways, it's how the Bible never stops.
A sheep in wolf's clothing, or a wolf in
Yes,
sheep
no, a
clothing.
sheep, no, exactly, a sheep in wolf's clothing. That's the point, is that I was a sheep in wolf's clothing, still on the good side, but I was looking like I was on the other side. It's just a weird way to look at things, but people, I mean, came out of his mouth. I mean, this was really happened to me, and he meant it as a compliment. I mean, it only could have been a compliment, but it still was weird. Anyways, so let's take a look at Jonah. And we're reading Jonah, even though in this room right here, we read Jonah at Yom Kippur back a few months ago, almost coming on 6 months ago, as part of Yom Kippur. Because we read Jonah every year at Yom Kippur, these 4 chapters. Now, we generally read it in about an hour and a half. Today, we're probably going to read the first part of it today, maybe the first 2 chapters, and then we'll read the rest of it next week. We're not in a time crunch to get to our end service, our Ne'ilah service, which we do. Synagogues do this differently. Some synagogues do Jonah before they leave for the day, for the morning service, and then some do what we do, which is do it as a mincha afternoon and then go into Ne'ilah. Every year people say the same thing. We're not going to learn something new from Jonah. There's no way possible. We've read this every year, and there's no way we can learn something new. And every year, I promise you'll see something new in it because you're different. You're new, and so it has something different. This will definitely be different because, number one, we have the Hebrew in front of us. Normally, we're not studying it with the Hebrew, but also very important, we're reading this in the context of the prophets. So we're reading this, and now you've read several other prophets. Even though you've read this prophet, most of the people here have read it with us at least once for high holidays. Most of you, not everybody, but most of you have read it at least once. You will see how different it is. Well, you probably remember it a little bit, and you already remember how different it is now from the prophets you just read, which include Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and we got into to Hosea, to Amos, to Joel. We have read, and now Obadiah. We've read several prophets. As you who have read this before, and if you haven't, as you are about to see, this is a 4-chapter book. It's not necessarily the smallest prophet, so that's not the issue. It's almost in the minor prophets, it's like midway average in book length, but it is 75% narrative. There's only 1 chapter of this that could be considered prophetic, and even within that, it's not really prophetic. The reality is that, again, we've read narrative in the prophets. We read some of Isaiah had prophecy, had narrative. Some of Ezekiel had narrative, where they told a story. This is almost all story. As a matter of fact, the prophecy to some extent in this is 5 words. So this is really, really different. Why is it even in the book of prophets is a fair question, because while he is a prophet, Jonah, this is not a book of prophecy. And so it's very different. It's in some ways much more similar to what we're going to read when we get to the Ketuvim, the last section of the Bible, especially like a book like Ruth, which is also, by the way, 4 chapters, is also like this kind of a novella, short story, a contained unit of a tale, and may have actually also been written around the same time. We don't know exactly when Jonah, the book, was written, but it's almost as if this book was written, put in the book of prophets because Jonah was a prophet, but it has no business being in the book of prophets. It is not a prophecy in the sense that we just read Obadiah, which was only 21 chapters, but that was very similar to Isaiah. It was very similar to Micah, or to we haven't read, but to Zephaniah and Zechariah. All the prophets we've read and the prophets we haven't read. That's very similar, 1 chapter. But this is 4 chapters, and none of these chapters really match anything that we've read. Well, interestingly, thank you, Mike, we actually know that Jonah was a prophet because he's actually mentioned in the book of Kings. So if we look at this note right here, it says Jonah is mentioned in the book of Kings. Now, what's so interesting about this is that Jonah is one of the only prophets who's mentioned elsewhere in the Bible. Very rarely do we have a prophet who's mentioned elsewhere in the Bible. We have some prophets, by the way, who are only mentioned in the Bible and we don't have their prophecy, right? Like Elijah is the most famous. Elisha and Elijah, those two guys, there is no book of Elijah. We don't have Elijah's book of prophecies, but we have a lot about him. And obviously we have a lot about him in the Midrash too. Elijah, we have texts, a lot of texts about him, but we don't have his prophecies. Then we have people like, for example, Obadiah. We know nothing about him. He's not mentioned anywhere else in the Bible, and yet we have his prophecy. But it's also the same for Ezekiel. We have no mention of Ezekiel anywhere else in the Bible. We do have a few prophets that are mentioned somewhere in the Bible. One of them is this guy, Jonah. The other one, by the way, is Isaiah. Isaiah is mentioned in the book of Kings. So he is actually quoted or referenced, I should say, and he's quoted in the book of Kings, which is interesting because it means that he was significant enough that he was also included historically in this. So what we have is a very unique situation of a prophet who is actually big enough, well known enough to have been mentioned. Now, I will tell you this, the reference, and we can jump there real quick, just says here. They're talking about Jeroboam, the king of Israel, and it says that it was he who restored the territory of Israel from Lebo Hamath to the Sea of Arava, in accordance with the promise of the Eternal, talking about Jeroboam. So that's good stuff that Jeroboam did. And this was the promise, the prophecies, the words that were made through God's servant, the prophet Jonah, the son of Amittai, from Gath Hefer. Now, it doesn't say here that Jonah is from Gath Hefer. It doesn't talk about the town that he's from, but this is clearly the same guy. Why? Because it mentions his father, Jonah, the son of Amittai. So most likely, this book was written about this guy, Jonah. He was known as a prophet. He was mentioned in the Bible, and a later writer wrote a story about him. Now, is this story meant to be a literal story? There are ancient commentaries on this. I'm talking about ancient rabbinic commentaries on the book of Jonah, which is the book of Jonah never happened. The whole thing is a dream, which means it didn't actually happen. Most of what happens in the book of Jonah seems like a dream, or seems at least like somebody was teaching a lesson. But we can get to, again, what that lesson might have been and why this book exists as we read it. And definitely by the time we finish it, we'll discuss why this book is here, why it is so important that we read it at Yom Kippur. Why is it that it's one of the few stories that we teach kids from the Bible? Like when they're little kids, we start teaching them the book of Jonah. And it is referenced many times. Jonah is referenced many times in Christian scriptures, as well as in the Quran. So, yes. And so Jonah is very important in Christianity and in Islam, probably because of the story of the fish, which is so memorable. But there's definitely something about Jonah that stands out for people, at least of Abrahamic faiths. In Arabic, the name Jonah is Yunus. So it's I would say in a positive way, it's a common name, Arabic name, especially in the area around Israel. There's of course a city in Gaza called Khan Yunus that you've heard of, which means the caravan stop of Yunus. But it's not our Jonah. It's not our Yunus, but Yunus in Arabic is the name for Jonah. So you don't see a lot of Yunuses necessarily in Pakistan or in Indonesia, but in the area around Israel, Yunus is oftentimes is not an uncommon name, I guess.
Yeah.
Yunus. Does she spell it like this? So the word Jonah in Hebrew is a dove. And so a Yonah is the bird that Noah sent out of the ark. So it's a symbol of peace to some extent early on in the Bible. And again, we don't know anything about Jonah from this book. We know that where he came from in the book of Kings and when he came. Because if he comes from the time of Jeroboam, and it's Jeroboam the second Jeroboam that we looked at, this is from the same time as the prophet Amos that we just read from. This is from the 700s. If Jonah is, if we put him chronologically where the Bible puts him, it means he is prophesying just before the Assyrian Empire destroys the northern kingdom, which is his kingdom. It's where he lives. So if Jonah knows that the Assyrians are bad people, they're a people that are going to eventually destroy his homeland, his friends and family, that they'll be responsible for that destruction, you could understand why Jonah doesn't want to help them. It gives you a little bit better idea that Jonah has vested interest in not making the Assyrians safe. This book, though, relates very little reality about Assyria, about the people at that time. There does not seem to be a real understanding of who the Assyrians were, which is one of the reasons why people say this was written hundreds and hundreds of years later after the Assyrian Empire came to an end. The Assyrian king is never mentioned here by name. The details of Nineveh, the capital of Assyria, which again Nineveh had long before been destroyed, and there maybe people were still living in the area around Nineveh. Nineveh, as we've mentioned before, is literally under Baghdad, or excuse me, Mosul, not Baghdad, but Mosul, the city in Iraq. It's part of Iraq today. And there's been a lot of wars and a lot of stuff even in that city in our own time. It is north of Baghdad, of where Babylon was. But this was the main capital of the Assyrian Empire, and it was at one point the greatest city in the world. Maybe not by this point, only from the standpoint is there is no description of the city other than it's a really big city. There's not like any landmarks in this that are identifiable. Nineveh had, during its heyday, amazing gates and amazing construction. None of that's referenced here. Again, it's not necessarily important, but there doesn't seem to be Nineveh doesn't seem to exist in a real way in this book. A lot of the elements of this book seem to be symbolic, or if not symbolic, metaphor, allegory, which is why, again, some people have said that this story is meant to teach a lesson rather than be taken literally. Of course, people love taking it literally because the idea of somebody being thrown into the ocean, the water, and being swallowed by a fish is the main thing that anyone ever remembers from this story. But let's take a look at it. We'll discuss a little bit about maybe why it exists the way it is. And again, we'll have a little bit more of a chance today to see the text in Hebrew, which we don't usually do on our Jonah studies on Yom Kippur. We don't have the Hebrew in front of us, and we don't have time to do that. Yeah.
Why do we read it?
And we'll talk about it as we read it. We're going to come to the points of why we read this book. Well, I will tell you this right off the bat, and without ruining the end of the story for you, this book is primarily about repentance and about whether people can repent, which is what we're supposed to do on Yom Kippur. So the teshuvah is overarching theme of this book. So we've been reading it on Yom Kippur for centuries, for thousands of years. We've been reading this book. And again, what does it teach us about our capacity for forgiveness, to give forgiveness, and also to ask for forgiveness? But that's why we read it. But let's take a look at how complex the story really is. For a 4-chapter little silly book about a guy being thrown into a fish, there's a lot going on here. So it's even more pronounced when you have it in Hebrew. All right, let's read it.
The word of God came to Jonah, son of Amittai. Go at once to Nineveh, that great city, and proclaim judgment upon it, for their wickedness has come before me. Jonah, however, started out to flee to Tarshish from God's service. He went down to Joppa and found a ship going to Tarshish. He paid the fare and went aboard to sail with others to Tarshish, away from God's service.
Yep. And so the words that are used here, again, let's assume that the first line is kind of like the statement of God's word coming to Jonah. That's the way the story, again, kind of begins with a prophetic command. And what does God say? Kum lech, get up and go. Those two phrases, kum lech, get up. And it does say, by the way, that Jonah vayikam, he does get up, but of course he does not go to where he's supposed to go. He goes in the opposite direction. And we point that out every year. He literally goes into the opposite direction. He's supposed to go northeast, he goes southwest. Let's assume he's in the northern part of Israel. He goes to the southern part of Israel, to Jaffa, our southern port near modern day Tel Aviv, and he goes and sails even further west, which is to Tarshish. So he doesn't go anywhere near the direction he is supposed to go. He goes in the opposite direction. And going to Tarshish in those days, we're not exactly sure where Tarshish would have been. It's either modern day Turkey, or it's possible that it is modern day Spain. I like the idea that he's trying to go to Spain. Now, Spain would have been the far reaches of where somebody from that kingdom from Israel would have gone. It was literally the end of the Mediterranean. It was the end of the earth. I like the idea that he's going to the ends of the earth. It was established, by the way, Tarshish was already established as a possible location in modern day Cadiz or Gadis in Spain. 100%. So there's a Phoenician outpost today, the city of Cadiz in Spain. It was called Gadis in Phoenician. Gadis. It could have been, again, him going all the way out towards that place. So it's literally as far west as you could possibly go. Again, it would be like if you were in Chicago and someone told you to go to New York and you went to Los Angeles instead. That is what he did. He went in the complete, or tried to go in the complete opposite direction. So I like the idea that he's not going to Turkey or going, farther, that, into an area where, a ship could have gone in a couple of days. I like the idea that he was going to the ends of the earth.
Make more sense that he's going to Turkey.
It would make more sense in the sense that, like, that's doable in a couple of days, but I don't know that I think he's trying to leave the planet. And if he's trying to leave the planet, you go to the furthest ends of the earth to get away from this, which is this idea that, like, if I really get far away from the land of Israel, I'm not going to be anywhere near where God's going to bother me anymore. And I like that idea that the author of this wants to tell us that this guy tried to get as far away from God as possible in his mind. If I'm at the other end of the world from Israel, God will leave me alone. And there are people who try to get away from life by going into a place where, again, no one will find them, or they hope that no one will ever bother them again. People still do that. So I think people feel sometimes that there's a place that they can go where they will no longer be bothered by their responsibilities anymore. And so I think that's a very I think that's a very human response that he had, which is, I am going to go in the complete opposite direction. As we've mentioned before, it's always worth mentioning as we read it in Hebrew, it says that he paid for the fare, right? That's the schara that he paid. And that is the fact that he maybe paid the entire fare, not just his fare, but the entire fare. He paid the fare, which in the ancient world means he chartered the vessel. He said, no longer do you guys have to wait around to start sailing. Here's the money, let's go. Why? Because in the ancient world, you did not buy a ticket on a passenger ship. If you wanted to go to a certain place, you oftentimes hopped along with the people who were sailing to a certain region. You walked around the port and said, hey, is anybody going off to Tarshish? And if they said, yeah, we're waiting to get some stuff or to get some passengers, how many passengers do you need to go? 2 or 3. Okay, here's the money, let's go. That's what he did. Because they would have a few passengers, they would have their goods, they would have their stuff, and they would go, okay, now we made enough money, we can set sail. So some people say he paid the entire fare. It's possible. Possible he paid for himself. It's possible he paid for the entire fare so that they could start going. What's interesting about it, of course, is that gets on the ship, right? He gets on the ship from Yaffo, and what it says is when he got into the ship, when he got aboard the ship, it doesn't actually just say he boarded the ship. It says Vayired ba, he went down inside of her. Is that what the King James says? Did the King James translate the Vayired? Yes, thank you, King James, for giving us a very important directional hint right here, which is he didn't go up, he went down. So what did he do? Twice it says, boom, get up. One time God tells him to get up. The other time he got up. But here it says instead, Vayired Yaffo. There they translated as he went down to Jaffa. He went down to Jaffa, but then he went down into the ship. So you can see directionally, he's supposed to go up. He doesn't. He goes down. He goes down to Jaffa, and he goes down into the ship.
3?
In 3. Vayired ba, he went down into her. So it says he went aboard. That's true. But it's much more powerful to say he went down into the ship.
Why?
Good, right? He's disappearing. He's going down. He's getting away. He's supposed to go up. He goes down. And so what's he doing is he's going further and further and further into this deeper place, which again, some people would say, this is also emotionally and spiritually what he's trying to do, which is going down, going away, trying to hide, going deeper and deeper. But what's interesting about it is the language actually reinforces it with the words Vayired. He goes down. And of course, we still use that phrase today when we're saying, are you feeling good? I'm feeling down. I'm feeling down. We still use that phrase to indicate not being happy. So he went down twice. He went down to Jaffa and he went down into the ship. He's not done going down to some extent.
But Mark, we also use that expression to go down from Israel when Israelis move away from Israel.
Yes, we do. Yeah, we do.
So
use the
politically,
word-
if you will, it also is used today.
Yes, we do. That's right. We say, we also, by the way, if you, someone pointed this out to me when I was at Oxford or Cambridge, you get sent down if you fail out of Oxford. You don't just leave Oxford, you go down. He was sent down from Oxford. So that's the phrase that they use. I don't know that we use that. If somebody left UCLA, we generally don't say he got sent down from UCLA.
No, never heard anybody say that, but
No, we just say
say it
flunked
a
out.
lot.
They
Flunked
flunked
out.
out. They flunked out.
At least
But
in old mystery stories.
in England, they say he was sent down. Everybody knows what it meant. He was sent down. Oh no,
Means you flunked out.
past USC. But yeah, you don't usually we said down, but yes, somebody had pointed out there's two places you go down from, Israel and from Oxford University. Anyways, so Jonah's on the ship. He's getting away. It says right there, from God's service. But it literally, melifnei Adonai means from in front of God. I'm getting away from God, from being in front of God. This idea that maybe he could. So here's what happens.
But God cast a mighty wind upon the sea, and such a great tempest came upon the sea that the ship was in danger of breaking up. In their fright, the sailors cried out, each to his own God, and they flung the ship's cargo overboard to make it lighter for them. Jonah, meanwhile, had gone down into the hold of the vessel, where he lay down and fell asleep.
Yeah. So what's interesting about that is that it seems that he actually went down into a deeper part of the ship. So if he went into the ship, maybe he was in the quarters before. He's definitely in the hull of the ship, but now he went down even further. So if he was in the sleeping quarters, now it seems like he went down into the place where they keep stuff, which they translated as into the hold of the vessel. So he's gone down again. And it says, Vayiskav Vayera Dam, which also has the root of it as they translate it as fell asleep, but it is another down. You see that? Vayera Dam. He went down into the hold and he went down into a very deep sleep. He didn't just lay down, that would be Vayishkav. He laid down. What's the translation you have, Mary?
Jonah was gone down from the sides of the ship, and he lay and was fast asleep.
Yeah, so they translate as the word Vayeredam as fast asleep. The phrase Yeredam is not a normal phrase in the Bible for going to sleep. We don't use that. The normal word for sleep in Hebrew isn't Vayishkav. Vayishkav literally means to go down. When you lie down and when you rise up. Vayishkav, right? It's that's the normal lying down, to sleep, but not necessarily sleep, lying down. But we use the word Yanus, Yanus, or that vowel, that verb is to go to sleep or slumber. This is not the word that we use normally for slumber. This is a very, very rare phrase for sleeping. It is literally like the sleep of not waking up, almost comatose. That's the phrase Yeredam. I'll show you another place, one of the few places that it's used. The very beginning of the Bible, when God made human beings, if you recall, God wanted a human for Adam, right? He wanted there to be a mate for Mr. Adam, for the human. So God cast a deep sleep on the human. Tardema. That's one of the few times we actually have that word. It's the sleep that God puts Adam into so he can pull this side out of him, this rib out of him to make Eve. Means it's a sleep that you almost need to have, yeah. Right? You're going to do surgery on somebody. That's how deep of sleep they're in. So that's the sleep that Jonah's in. It's not a normal sleep. It's not a sleep of, I'm tired. This is a sleep that I really don't want to wake up from. So he went down and he went down into this deep sleep, which again, the root of it is going down. And you can imagine it's like going down for the count. That's why the phrase in Hebrew is so powerful, that it has both. He lay down and he went down. He was down. So he's sleeping, and he's not just sleeping, but he's sleeping in a way that he does not want to be woken up. One could even postulate that he took something to make himself go to sleep. because you almost need to have some kind of anesthetic, or I don't know, propofol or whatever you're going to knock yourself out with in order to be that asleep. So the ship is going crazy. It says that they're going nuts. They're screaming. They are crying out to their gods, each to his own god, right? And that's the idea that the sailors are worshiping lots of gods. They each have their own god, and they're throwing stuff overboard to lighten up the ship so that they're hoping it won't sink. And again, what is he doing? He's going down. He's just going down further and further. So, again, the phrases that are used here that are repeated also point out to Ruach Gedolah, Sar Gadol, a great wind, a great tempest. It's not just, a tempest. It's not just a storm. It's a great storm. The word Gadol and Gedolah, imply that this is not like, this is really, really, really bad. So he's down fast asleep. And what happens here? What do they say?
The captain went over to him and cried out, "How can you be sleeping so soundly? Call upon your God. Perhaps the God will be kind to us and we will not perish."
Yep. And here the captain, we want to point out, says the same thing that God said. Kum, get up. Which again, they translated as just up, but I would translate it as arise or get up. What does the King James say, Mary? Arise, right? It should be the same word. However you translated kum before when God said kum, you definitely should use the same phrase now. Get up. And the fact that the words are once spoken by God and now spoken by a Gentile captain, that's pretty significant, because the words are resonating in Jonah's ears 2 times. I was called by God to get up, and now this captain's told me to get up. Well, because of the next phrase, he says, perhaps the God will be kind to us and we will not perish.
But he didn't know it at the time.
He didn't.
What Jonah was.
He didn't. But he knew, and we know, that everybody before, the sailors, were crying out each to his own God. So we know that these people are worshiping other gods. It makes it pretty clear that they're worshiping other gods, because they are still not even assuming that Jonah is worshiping God, which is weird because they just left from Israel. And if they knew anything about the way Israelites worship, you would think that they maybe would assume that Jonah is worshiping the God, the one God, but they don't seem to know, which indicates either that, again, this book is not meant to be taken literally, in the sense that we're supposed to rationally connect the fact that the crew is supposed to know that Jonah, or assume that Jonah was Jewish. They clearly don't know who he was, because if they did, they wouldn't have asked him to do that, because they would have known he's already a prophet, which they would have probably been, they would have had some recognition of it, but they don't even know he's a Jew. They don't know he's a Jew.
Yeah, but far cry to say the sailors cried out and lumped the captain in with the sailors. That's the crew.
Yeah, but the problem is that the reason we could say the captain is no different is that he says to him, perhaps the God will be kind to us. He doesn't seem to, at least at this stage, really know that there's only one God. He doesn't say, maybe you'll speak to God. He's doing exactly what the other guys are doing. What?
There's interesting when they're talking about the mariners, they call them mariners instead of
Yeah.
sailors, into his God, the G is small.
Yep.
But
Yeah.
in this, it says arise and fall upon thy God, and the G is capital.
I could see, I could see how that could exist, but that means that the captain knew that Jonah was worshiping that God. I don't think the Hebrew calls for that because El Elohecha means God, your God. El Elohecha, the God who is your God, will do that, which also seems to imply that everybody can have their own God and it's all okay.
Listen
So it is also this idea that God can, anybody can have their own God, which there's no condemnation of that. They're at this point all trying to figure out how can we get saved, and their natural inclination is to pray to their gods. Well, they don't just pray to their gods; they throw their stuff off the ship, right? They're trying to do stuff, and they're also praying. Which, by the way, shows you that they're not just praying; they're also trying to fix the situation. So they're not just saying, "Oh, God, help me." They're throwing stuff off over. But again, Jonah has checked out. He's not helping them. He's not even praying. And that seems to upset the captain. The captain seems to not be happy with that because he's not doing anything. He's not doing anything. He doesn't care about what's happening. The fact that they might die and he is sleeping. That is definitely the situation where they feel that they're about to die. So
He wanted to.
he doesn't seem to care. Doesn't seem to care, right?
He's been on lots of ships through many storms. And it's very
Yeah, but this one does seem to be significant because watch what happens here. Here's what happens. What's the next thing they do?
Those aboard said to one another, "Let us cast lots and find out on whose account this misfortune has come upon us." They cast lots, and a lot fell on Jonah.
So it's clearly a problem, right? Well, look, what you're seeing here, John, is that this does seem to be a setup, right? There seems to be all along this feeling like, why are these things happening, right? Well, they do something else, right? They do the lots. They find out that the lot is on Jonah, which at this point probably didn't surprise anybody. But the fact that they're trying to figure out who is responsible for this indicates that, again, what's happening, there has to be a divine reason for this happening. This does not seem to be anywhere near like kind of a normal situation. Look, the Midrash asks that question, like, how did they know that this wasn't just a really bad storm? And that happens, right? That happens. You're out on the sea. All of a sudden stuff gets rough and you're like, oh, I didn't know that this was going to happen. That happens, right? Ship happens, as they say, right? It's not impossible. So here's what the Midrash is. The Midrash is that no, they're looking around and there's ships around them and they're not dealing with what's happening. It's just happening over them. So they know that this is divine because they see other ships and they're sailing around. There's nothing wrong. Right over them, there's a big dark cloud. There's a turbulent. There's maybe like some kind of death hole out there that the water's spinning around and you're going to get sucked into this hole. Like, this is not normal. And so the way that it's set up is this doesn't seem like just a bad storm or something that happens when you're out on the sea. This is something that is definitely remarkable, a miracle. God is doing something to someone, and now they know who it is. They cast the lots. And again, we talk about how on Yom Kippur, we read about the story of the scapegoat and how lots were cast. It's the same word, goral. So it harkens back to the casting of lots for which goat is going to be sacrificed and which one's going to be sent to Azazel. So there's this sense of a little bit of what we do on Yom Kippur as well, or what we did on Yom Kippur. But again, there is an understanding that this is ra'ah. This is bad. This is not just a little storm. This isn't something we just got to sail ourselves out of. This is something crazy, bad miracle, a nightmare. It's not a good thing.
What we
So-
still call an act of God.
Yes, we call it an act of God, though we don't call it a miracle. It's an act of God, but it's something that, again, there's no rational explanation for how this was going to happen. Yeah, though now we use the act of God to be natural disasters that we do have explanations for, but we still call them acts of God, even though, again, we could tell the insurance company that's what happened. It was not God, it was an earthquake. All right, it's tectonic shifts, plates. Anyways, so now they asked the big question.
They said to him, "Tell us, you who have brought this misfortune upon us, what is your business? Where have you come from? What is your country, and of what people are you?"
So they know that this badness, the ra'ah, is because of you. So they say, what is your business? Right? What is your business? What is your malachtecha? What is your profession, if you will? What is your work? Me'ein tavo, where do you come from? What is your country? And of what people are you? Now, what's interesting about that is that seems to imply that the land that you come from is not necessarily where you originally were from, which is interesting. It shows people had movement and migration even then, but it also shows you that there is an ethnicity, an that you're from, which is different from your land, which is different from where you started out from. What's interesting, of course, is that, we've already seen this, which is when Abraham is commanded by God to get from the land that he was born, from the land of his father, that there's an understanding that there are different levels of belonging, a place where you came from, a land that you come from, your nationality, if you will, but also a people that you could be a part of. Now, what's interesting is today we would say, oh, that's definitely the case. There's people who, my wife came from England. She's an American now, officially, right? She is a Jew. She has different identities. And as an American, some of us have different identities and different ways that we define ourselves. And they're not all necessarily the same. And at least in Jonah, these are already different possibilities, which is very interesting. It tells us that there was, even in the ancient world, different types of identities that are that were ascribed to people, and the way people would choose to identify themselves was a little bit more fluid than we would have thought. And then just say to somebody, "Oh, I'm an Israelite," or to say I was an Edomite, or say I'm Phoenician or Assyrian. I could be a Jew who lives in Phoenicia, who was originally from Babylonia. So all of these things could have been a possibility, and it tells us, again, not so much different. We're not that much different today. And here's his answer.
"I am a Hebrew," he replied. "I worship the Eternal, the God of heaven, who made both sea and land."
That's his only answer.
He doesn't
was
answer
asked-
that question at all. He answers a
asked-
question they didn't ask. They
He
didn't
was
ask him
asked-
who his God
He was
was.
asked 4 questions, and he essentially gave them 2 answers. Only one of them could be considered an answer necessarily of what they asked him, which is, what people are you? So he really answered, I'm a Hebrew, right? Which is what it says, Ivri. He doesn't say Yehudi, he doesn't say Yisraeli. He says Ivri, which Hebrew could include technically Edom, Moab, Ammon. All of those people are Ivrim. All of those people are Hebrew peoples. They were all people that were part of Abraham's people. Abraham's people are all, again, this is somewhat interchangeable. It doesn't really say, I'm a Jew, or I'm B'nai Yaakov, I'm a son of B'nai Israel, but he could have said B'nai Israel. He could have said B'nai Israel, I'm an Israelite. It doesn't say that. He says, I'm a Hebrew, which is almost the least identifiable Jew that you could be in the most general sense. Because as I said, it doesn't even include all only Jews. And then he says, I worship God. I worship Adonai. My God is, again, the God of heaven, who also made the sea and the land. And as we talked about before, these are the three worlds that the ancient world, and at least around Israel, recognized: three lands, three cosmos, three biomes. There's only three: the land and the heavens and the waters. That, again, here he says, I worship the God of heaven, who also is the one who made the waters, and the land. It's a strange phrase, because it's not the way we normally describe God, but it is a nice way of describing God for somebody who worshiped different gods. That my God is the God of everything. My God is a God who made all of these things. And so that is his answer. His answer is, this is the God who made everything. He uses the word Adonai. He uses that Yud He Vav He name. He says, I worship Adonai. And what's interesting, of course, here too, is that for the people who were mariners, who were people who lived on the sea, they obviously were more concerned with the gods of the waters. But he's saying right now, yeah, my God makes the heavens, but also makes the water, and he makes the dry land. So, he all three are included in it, but the way he said it is almost as if he says, by the way, how does your King James translate the word? I bet you it doesn't say I worship. What does it say? Yeah. Ani yareh, I fear. I revere. The word, this phrase, yirah or yareh here, which means I fear, is really interesting, because he doesn't say I worship. That's kind of a less dramatic way of, I could say I revere, but I fear could also be a good translation of that. I fear this God. And, the God of heaven, who made the waters and who made the earth, definitely at this stage, they're all kind of, maybe not Jonah so much, but fearing the water and fearing what the water could do right now is definitely something that you could understand, putting it in that term of fear. But worship doesn't really convey that idea of yirah, which is reverence or fear. And we oftentimes use the phrase yirat hashamayim, fear of heaven. It's used, especially in the Orthodox world, to indicate kind of like, a real sense of humility, a sense of this person really has yirat hashamayim. They have a real sense of humility. So this seems to imply that he has a fear of it, but again, you can decide whether he's actually acting that way. But that's the word that he uses, yareh, which I think is important because of the next line.
The men were greatly terrified, and they asked him, what have you done? And when the men learned that he was fleeing from God's service, for so he told them.
Yeah, look how many times this word yirah was just used in that next line. The men were greatly terrified. The men, and this is a tough translation. How do you even translate this? Mary, how does the King James translate that fear? Yeah, exceedingly afraid. But the word yirah is used twice. Yiru hanashim, yirah gedolah. And again, there's a big storm. There's a big tempest. There's big wind. There's big tempest. And now there's big fear. Yirah gedolah. Now they're really afraid. And so they're afraid, and then they're really, this great fear overtook them, which again is a panic. Like, this is now not a normal fear. Okay, so they were afraid, exceedingly afraid, but however you want to translate that, they were fearful and they were greatly feared. And they said, "What have you done? What have you done?" And this is where the conversation really doesn't take place in front of us, because it just says, and the men learned that he was fleeing from God's service, right? He told them that. It's not like they had to get an image of it. He told them. It's not like God suddenly gave them. He told them. It says, he gidlahem. He told them what happened. Now, we don't know exactly how he told it. Doesn't say. Doesn't say how he explained it to them, which is interesting, because how does he explain this to them? I'm a prophet. I mean, think about what he could say. I'm a prophet. I tried to get away from God because I didn't want to give the prophecy. And now you're all suffering for this. You are all now part of this nightmare. I don't know. Maybe he just said it in a very simple way. But they knew now that he was fleeing from God's service. He was supposed to be in front of God, doing God's stuff, and now they're caught in the crossfire. Yeah.
Let's backtrack all the way to 1.
Yeah.
Said he's a prophet.
Yep. Yep.
If God tells you to do something, and he's never told you before, it surprised him, I'm sure, and scared him. And he freaked out.
So do we know for sure that this was the first time that God spoke to him? We don't, but it is possible. It is possible that this is his first time he was called.
And so couple that with what's going on with the storm. Right? So you see, you're right. Every time we do see something, because I didn't even think about that till now. It's like, okay, why is he, why is everybody so distraught at what's going on beside a storm? They're sailors. They've been in a storm before. So this must be a really bad storm, but he can't say he's a prophet. He doesn't know he's a prophet. You know, God came to him.
Well,
I don't know. What could
he's told them now they're essentially suffering for what he did, right? So he's actually saying, he told them, whatever he told them at this point, he tells them at least that he's fleeing from God. He's trying to get away from God, a God that he just said controls everything. So now they know this, but look at what he says to them.
God cast a mighty wind upon the
Well,
sea.
yeah. But here's what.
But they didn't know. Okay. Nobody knew that. We know.
So they asked the question. Here's the next part of this, which again, they don't even say is a different sentence. They put a comma.
In section 4.
Yeah.
The writer of Jonah. How does the writer know that God cast a mighty wind upon the sea?
Well,
I guess because the wind.
Yes,
happened.
that has.
How else could it happen unless God? Okay.
Yes, the point of this is that this is not normal. This is not normal stuff. So they ask a question here.
They said to him, "What must we do to you to make the sea calm around us?" For the sea was growing more and more stormy.
So it doesn't stop. So with the intensity, I mean, it's already bad. We know it's bad already, and it's getting even worse. So according to this, it is getting even more so. It's getting more difficult. So it definitely said that there was wind. It said ruach. Now it's focusing more on the fact that the sea itself it's really bad on the sea, right? Here it just says the sea is going nuts. So whatever's happening with the wind, that's already happened. But now the sea is becoming more and more stormy. And this is what he says to them, because they say, what do we do? They said to him, what do we do? What must we do? Right? So that's what they said. Mana said, what do we do? And he answered them.
He answered, heave me overboard, and the sea will calm down for you. For I know that this terrible storm came upon you on my account.
So he tells them, he says, heave me overboard. He says that to them because he says, I'm responsible for this. And he, the phrase that he used is, again, it's not a phrase that we use a lot, but it is throw me over, throw me over, throw me down, throw me out.
Nevertheless, the men rowed hard to regain the shore, but they could not, for the sea was growing more and more stormy about them.
Yeah. And so here, what's interesting is that, let's say it's the ship has sails, the sails they've taken down, but they're now rowing. They're trying to get back to shore. So he told them what to do, and they don't want to do it. They don't want to kill him. So the interesting thing is that we oftentimes forget this part, which is that they did not listen to him. They did not throw him overboard to begin with. They actually tried to save his life. And this is where we see the crew behaving in a way that we do not expect. And we have to step back and say, come on, is that really believable? Because if we were in a situation like this and we were no question that what we're seeing is an act of God, if the person tells us that they're the reason why this is happening and that the only way to stop this is to essentially get me off the ship, would we really try not to? I mean, some of us might say, yeah, I don't want to take that chance. I don't want to sacrifice a guy and see if that works. But there are probably a lot of us who would say, the guy said to throw him overboard. This is not normal. We've tried everything. We've thrown everything overboard. We've already lost our cargo. This guy who we don't know, we don't really have an affiliation with the guy. This guy's told us what to do. He said, throw me overboard. He didn't just say, I'm responsible for it. He said, throw me overboard. He said that. They didn't do it, which is why this story, to some extent, at this point right here, is taking on a level of apology for the Gentiles that we have to kind of pay attention to. Because this isn't just normal, hey, they didn't want to kill him. They actually do the most honorable thing, which is try to get back to shore and not do this. So it says they tried not to do this, tried not to do what he told them to do.
Then they cried out to God, oh, please, Eternal One, do not let us perish on account of this man's life. Do not hold us guilty of killing an innocent person. For you, O Eternal One, by your will have brought this about.
And this is a prayer that the Gentiles offer. Please, Adonai, and it uses the word Adonai, not once, twice, and a third time. God, Eternal One, don't hold us responsible for what we're doing right now. This is not something we want to do. Don't hold us guilty for this. And they say, God, you have made this happen. You are making this happen, which is a very interesting phrase. The phrase again in Hebrew is, don't bring upon us the blood, the dam, right? Which is also a very powerful way of saying you're responsible for someone's death. I don't want their blood on my hands, which is the way it really should be translated. King James have any use of the word blood there?
But not on us, innocent.
Yeah. So that's a phrase that we would use. Dam naki, innocent blood. They translate it as innocent person, which again, I think takes away a little bit of the power of what he's saying or what they're saying, which is, we don't want innocent blood on our hands. Okay. So they're still saying to some extent, The innocent person is Jonah. He's the innocent person, which again, he's not really innocent. He made this all happen. But did he kill someone? Are we punishing someone who's committed a crime? No. This is an innocent person in their minds. The guy didn't do anything to them, even though he's bringing this upon them. He didn't kill them yet. He hasn't killed them yet, but they don't want to be held responsible. And that's a very, very powerful and very enlightened kind of prayer, which is, don't hold us responsible for the death of someone. And we are supposed to, as I pointed out before, this crew of sailors, we are meant to think that these are some tough dudes. These are not guys that we would normally think would say something like that. Salty guys. They had to be. And here's what happened.
And they heaved Jonah overboard, and the sea stopped raging.
That's it. They threw him overboard. And the sea stopped raging. It does not say, by the way, that they put him in the mouth of the fish, because that's not what it says, though that's oftentimes the way it was depicted in art, where they literally put him inside of a fish, which, is that a good thing or a bad thing? Because you think that was kind of a dangerous thing to put someone inside of a mouth. In some of the depictions in the Middle Ages, again, Christian art, that they literally put him inside a shark, which would be really bad. But I think people always had a hard time with these sailors being as good as they are supposed to be. I don't, because I think they're a foil. I think they're meant to be an allegory. They're meant to not be, they're meant to play on our emotions and our stereotypes, and they're meant to be a cartoon to some extent. They're meant to be a ridiculous and somewhat humorous play on what was going to happen. And then let's read the last line of this chapter.
The men feared God greatly. They offered a sacrifice to God, and they made vows.
Yep. And there is the phrase again, 2 times. Yirah ha'anashim, yirah gedolah, a great fear. And clearly the great fear is not that they're going to die, because they're not going to die anymore. The fear, the sea stopped raging. So this fear comes about solely because they recognize that God is the one in charge. And when it says that they made a sacrifice to God, that means, at least according to our understanding, they went to Jerusalem and offered up a sacrifice. By the rabbis' admissions, these people all become great Jews. Not only did they offer sacrifice, but also they made vows, which assumedly was, we're only going to worship you now, God. So when we talk about a vow, which we talk about at Yom Kippur, at Kol Nidre, Vayidru Nedarim. The word neder, a vow, means again, a promise, a sacred vow. And we assume that that vow is connected to their sacrifice, which is, we're only going to worship you now, God. And they became essentially, again, according to our understanding, they became Jewish. They weren't Jewish when they got on the ship. When they got off, they're Jewish. Why? Because they saw a miracle. They saw that their lives were almost taken away from them, and they had a conversion. They went through a conversion. Why? Because they were adjacent to this. They were in the presence of Jonah, and Jonah unwittingly, again, he didn't intend to do this. At the worst, he didn't care whether they died. He ended up turning them Jewish. Think about it. He was on a ship with them, and because he was on the ship with them, they ended up becoming Jewish. According to the rabbis, according to the Midrash, these sea guys end up moving to Israel, becoming Orthodox Jews, and their descendants are us, the rabbis. They said, we're descendants of these guys. They wanted to be descendants of these guys because as far as they're concerned, they're heroes. They're people who saw the light of God and were changed by it. And so they like this idea that of the people that have come into our people, that these are some of those people. These are people who saw the light and they loved it. And they said, we're going to be Jewish now. So Jonah can't even help it. He's making Jews, even in his stupid idea that he can get away from God. He's helping to spread, they're helping to spread God's message. Now, again, what is it about God that would have been so nice? I mean, look, these people they're living or they're witnessing the midst of this terrible destruction, right? But yet something happens in it that we assume that it's not just their fear, it says their fear, they're fearful of God, but it's this also this awe and reverence, whatever this feeling about God that they have. Where does this come from? And some people have pointed out it's Jonah's understanding or statement that I was running away from God. I can't run away from God. The God that I worship is inescapable. There's no place that I can get away from God. And whatever he explained to them, however he explained to them that he was not doing what God wanted them to do, they also see from Jonah this understanding that he is going to take responsibility for it. And to some extent, Jonah did do something that was the right thing to do, which is, I'm not going to have everyone killed.
Right.
What do you think he's doing?
It's not away from an obligation that God asked him to take on. They haven't given him a big deal, and he didn't want it.
So
We don't know much about the guy. Maybe he was immature, he was irresponsible, maybe, who knows? I mean, if the rabbis can make a jump that these guys are, converted to Judaism, then that's not a part of the Bible.
that
You're starting to read in between the lines.
no, you're so you exactly. So you get your reading of this is that he is not escaping from God.
He's not escaping from Judaism. He's escaping.
Oh, I don't think.
Dig a hole, and
I don't think, yeah, I don't think he's thinking he can stop being Jewish. I think he realizes that he's been called to do something, and in his mind, does he think he can get away from it by going the opposite direction? I mean, he did, he tried. However he thought he was going to get away from God, he tried. I mean, look, some people have said, if he thinks that the farthest I can get away from God, the less likely God's going to call me and tell me to do something, because I'm not even living there anymore. God will speak to me if I'm in the land of Israel, but maybe if I'm in the land of Tarshish, he won't speak to me anymore. I'm so far away that God won't even ask me to do anything anymore. I mean, that's a normal thing. Look, if I'm in Israel, I hear the message, right? It's loud and clear. God's talking to me in the land of Israel, but maybe if I get really far away from Israel, that sound will go away. I won't hear that anymore.
Well,
By the way, there's still Israelis, by the way, who do this, who feel, and again, I'm not saying it's not necessarily a religious call, but there's Israelis who feel, look, I've got to get away from Israel because the obligations I have to Israel are too much for me. And I'm not saying every Israeli who immigrates feels this way, but there are Israelis, and I've met them before, who live on the far reaches of the world, who think to some extent, look, I can't, this is too much for me. The connections and the responsibility I have to Israel is too much for me to bear.
And on 10/8, many of those people that were in far-flung parts of the globe were on planes going back.
A lot of them were, but some of them weren't, John. And the reason is that there are people who are like at least Jonah at that moment, which is, it's too much for me. I can't deal with it. I don't want to deal with it. I don't want to have God telling me what to do. I don't want to have my community telling me what to do. I don't want my country telling me what to do. So I got to check out. And there are people who do that. And again, there are a lot who didn't. Look, I have young students, some of my students who served in the Israeli army, who felt very guilty that they weren't there on 10/8. I don't know what to tell them. I mean, look, I told them, you already did you did service already, but there were a lot of people who felt that way. And I get it. I mean, I don't know what I would have done if I was in their situation, but I will tell you that there are people who also didn't want to be bothered. And look, John, I mean, you can make the argument that Jews who don't want to deal with this, Jews who want to say, hey, look, Israel's wrong, and I don't want to be responsible for this, so I'll renounce Israel. I'll renounce me. Going back to what we talked about at the beginning, there's a certain level of, hey, if this is not my problem, if I don't have to deal with this, then I'm not responsible for the good and the bad. I just don't have to be responsible for it. Look, I'm going to make this comment about Jonathan Glazer and people who feel like him, and Jews who do this. there is a, I don't agree with it, and I'm not making an apology for it, but there is this sense that if I renounce Israel, if I renounce that responsibility of having a connection, a Zionist connection, then I'm not responsible for anything bad that Israel does. And I can take the position that I'm a Jew who only cares about everybody, and I don't care about a nationalism anymore. There are people who do that. There's hundreds of thousands of Jews who've decided to do that. Not the majority, not according to statistics, 90% of us, but there is a percentage of Jews who take that stance.
Or he's just a coward.
Well, could be. It could be, but there's also a feeling like I don't have to be responsible. If I renounce this, if I renounce this, it's easier from the standpoint of then I don't have to be connected to any of it. Now, the irony is that, as we've seen, renouncing your connection to Israel will do you as much good as the Jews who thought they had converted to Christianity during the Holocaust. You will not be given a pass by people who hate Israel or who hate Jews because they hate Jews. And some of the people who were murdered on October 7th were very, very pro-Palestinian homeland and rights and two-state solutions and giving, withdrawing from every piece of Israel that was conquered in 67. Some of the people that were murdered on October 7th were those people. They didn't care. They were not, nobody gave them a choice on October 7th of how do you feel about the occupation? They were murdered. I know because I talked to some of their families. They lived in Kibbutz Be'eri, which was a very, very left-wing kibbutz, where 10% of the kibbutz was murdered on October 7th. So, and many of them were captured, taken hostage. So like I said, it works as well as those Jews who walked around Auschwitz and Bergen-Belsen and Buchenwald and said, I'm not Jewish anymore, I go to church. Why am I here? So it doesn't work for the people who really hate us, but there are people who've opted to do that throughout history, and there's people who are going to do that now. And I definitely don't agree with it. I'm on the opposite side, but I do understand where it comes from. And it comes from a point of doing what, to some extent, Jonah might have been doing, which is, I want to get away from this. I want to have nothing to do with any of this responsibility. On the other hand, Jonah did do something pretty noble, which is tell the people, look, it's my responsibility. I'm the one who's caused this, and throw me overboard. And so as much as he's escaping his responsibility as a prophet, he doesn't really escape his responsibility as a human being to say to the other people on the ship, I'm the one who's responsible for this. He didn't say, I don't know. I have no idea, because that could have been the story. Could have been the story of Jonah didn't tell the truth. Jonah didn't tell the people why the storm was raging. That could have been the story. It's not the story. The guy did say, I'm responsible for this, and throw me overboard. So he did do that. But again, that's why the story is much more complex than this is a story of a guy who just is a mean guy, is a guy who doesn't do his responsibilities, or that, all the things that people say about Jonah. It's not like that. It's much more complicated than that, because he did rise to the occasion in this moment where he's given a choice to tell the truth or to just say, I don't know, I'm not sure.
Or the storm caught him off guard, that he can't run away. That God, all of a sudden he was told what to do out of time. He goes,
But
now I'm gonna get away from it.
but John, you know what he didn't tell the crew? Take me back to the land so I can do my job. That's the difference. And that's why this is such a complicated story, because he didn't say, hey, take me to the shore. I know what I got to do now. I got to go do what God told me to do. He's not ready yet. We'll see that next week, chapter 2. Well, actually, we won't. We'll see. Yeah, we will see it, because we'll read more than chapter 2. But that's why, as I said, you can learn something new every time you read this. Definitely. I mean, I read this September 29th or whatever. I read this a week and a half before October 7th. I can't read this now without thinking about that. How many times did I mention it? How many times? I can't tell you how many times I thought about it. But it's impossible not to read this now without thinking about, what's our responsibility here? Where does a Jew stand when they're called to say something now, today? And what would you do in this situation? And what do we do when we're called to say something? I don't know what to tell you. And I've talked with especially kids, including my own kids, who've had to deal with this lately, and how to deal with stuff that I never thought we'd have to deal with. Like I said, including my own
But
children.
Jonah's being told to go and save the people who are the enemies of the Jewish people, which is.
Well, we haven't gotten to that point yet, but yes, Rosemary, when we think about what we would do if, then we take that to the next level, is what do you do if you were told by God to go to Hamas and go to Gaza and tell the people what to do? Because we haven't gotten to that point yet. What do we do with our enemies? And again, sometimes our enemies are not the people who have the knife to our throats at the moment, but they're people who are going to be responsible, which was the people of Nineveh, who are not necessarily fighting with us at this moment, but they will be. And again, whether it's whoever it is, whether we would try to save those people or not. It's something to think about as we get to the next few chapters. So thank you, Rosemary, very much. We will be online next week. We're not in person. So for the people who are here, please join us in person. We'll be online next Tuesday. And in the meantime, I hope everyone stays well. We're going to have a Shabbat with Rick and Addie this week, and also our religious school kids. So it will be a lot of fun. And we'll see you, if not tomorrow night for Kiavot, we'll see you maybe Friday or one of these days coming up. Thanks, everybody. See you later.
Everybody,
Bye. Bye-bye. Thanks, Rosemary.
You want
thank
to-
you.